Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. So yes, I am the chair of the Hispanic Marketing Council. And for those of you who might not be familiar with us, we are the trade organization that champions Hispanic marketing and helps marketers and brands capitalize on the opportunity that is presented. The organization was founded in 1996, and we've been working with companies and brands ever since. So let's dive right in terms of why is the Hispanic market such an attractive opportunity for Hispanic marketers in the US. So starting with the power of the Hispanic market. So many of you may know how large the Hispanic market is. Currently, it is almost 64 million individuals in the United States who are Hispanic. So that makes us the largest ethnic minority. And we like to call it the majority minority, as that number continues to grow. And the US buying power has reached over $3.4 trillion. And to put that into perspective, we could talk about the fueling of the growth. So the reason why marketers enjoy this market so much and want to capitalize it is because Hispanics are really driving the US economy for many different reasons. Obviously, there's continuous population growth. There is a very high degree of workforce participation in all sectors, and increased productivity due to increased educational attainment over the years. More and more Hispanics are able to achieve college degrees and beyond. So that makes it very attractive for contributions to the economy.
Isabella?
Yes, sir.
I'm very sorry to interrupt. Could we have you share your slides again? Since we went on stage, we just don't have the slides up right now.
Well, isn't that a technical problem?
Sorry to interrupt.
I didn't realize that I needed to do
No
that
problem.
again.
Now I knew you were referring to your slides, and I could see that we didn't see them. So now we can, and you're all set to go.
Okay, great. I apologize. So I'll go back a little bit just to show the numbers here that I highlighted. So again, 63.7 million at a 3.4 trillion buying power. In terms of fueling the growth, you can see how impressive it is in terms of how Hispanics are really contributing to the growth all across the board and really outpacing all the other segments. In terms of putting it into perspective, the US Hispanic market, if you were to compare it to how it compares to the world stage, if we will, in terms of leading economies, the US Hispanic market is fifth behind the US, China, Japan, Germany. So you can see here how impressive that is. As it applies to specific growth, you can see the US Hispanic is third. So this is just increasingly making it more and more important for marketers to really capitalize on this opportunity. Another reason why marketers are really attracted to this group is that it is a very long life-term proposition in terms of capturing Hispanics as consumers and clients. Hispanics, we are significantly younger than in the other group, and the majority of us are under the age of 34. And the most common age right now is 19. And that is a huge difference when you compare that to 61-year-olds for non-Hispanic whites. So that becomes a strong proposition for all categories in terms of growth and the opportunity to capitalize on this market. By 2029, which will be here before we know, it seems far away, but it's not really, almost 28% of Gen Z population will be the majority, and 25% millennials will be Hispanic. So again, Hispanics are everywhere. As if you're in the United States, you see that everywhere. Oops. But Hispanics are certainly not one group. We're by no means, sometimes folks ask us like what Hispanics are like, and we always have to explain that we're so diverse and multifaceted. And we, of course, come from many different countries, as you can see here on the map. And this really comes into the richness of dialects, traditions, behaviors, preferences, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. But the majority in the US of the Hispanic population coming from Mexico. But that number is, other countries are growing all the time. terms of language, so speaking of language, right, which one always says, well, do Hispanics really speak much Spanish? And it all depends on where you are in the US, and you can hear it dialed up or dialed down, depending on the acceptance of the language. But Hispanics are asked about their language in one of 5 ways. So do you only speak Spanish? Do you mostly speak Spanish? Do you speak Spanish and English equally, or mostly English, or only English? As you can see here, the spread is rather wide in terms of folks who identify with one of these 5 groups. But when you bundle them together, Spanish dominant, as we call them, or Spanish preferred, is almost 39% of the population. Non-Spanish dominant, so the balance of that is about 61%, and then English dominant is 37%. Oops. So what becomes really interesting about the importance of the Spanish language is that even though there's a large share of US born Hispanics these days that perhaps weren't born in a country of origin, they still remain very prideful and know that the importance of the language is really crucial in terms of job growth, being able to keep their language alive. So as you can see here, we've got all the different categories. So the first is among Hispanics total in aggregate, 85% say it's really important for future generations to be able to speak Spanish, 85%. Then the second column there is FB, foreign born. So 92% of those who come to this country, they really want their children to be able to keep the Spanish language alive. US born goes down to 79%, but that's still a big percentage. And then as you can see, there's variance across the board. And the reason is as folks are really realizing how helpful it is to be bilingual for the job market, for cultural enrichment, and really be able to stay connected to their roots. And this is really important for those, especially those of us who have family back home. So you always want your kids to be able to communicate with your relatives back home. So this has continued to grow, and this is rather different from perhaps other cultures that have immigrated to this country over the generations where they haven't kept Spanish quite as prominent and quite as alive. So Spanish, or another language in the US, for some is a bit controversial, right? There are some people who think that if you live in this country, you should speak English. But Spanish is becoming really normalized in American mainstream. And what this picture is a few weeks ago, Bad Bunny was the host of Saturday Night Live. So if any of you haven't seen it, it's very funny and I highly recommend it. But here he did the entire show in Spanish. And occasionally someone would translate. There was sort of a lot of back and forth banter. But it really, really showed that NBC, a network, a US network-based network, was willing to go out and capture this market and say, you know what, we're going to normalize this. So there's been a lot of articles. The one that's sourced here is from Billboard magazine. And I highly recommend taking a read at it because it really talks about the importance of Spanish, the normalization, and how it's really become American mainstream. I know a lot of people personally who have no Spanish roots, and they're doing a lot to try to learn the Spanish language. They're one of the most downloaded apps on the Apple iPhone world happens to be Duolingo and some other Spanish apps. So Spanish is becoming more and more important for folks in the United States, and mainstream media is really encouraging that as well. Oops, okay. All righty. So Spanish also has always been seen in music. So when you look at around the country, there's hundreds and hundreds of Spanish language radio stations. And typically those have been historically listened to by Spanish speaking individuals, right? People love to listen to their music. And depending on where you are in the country, there's a different number of stations and a different type of genre. So I happen to live in Miami. So here in Miami, we have a lot of salsa stations, baladas, románticas, things like that. Some talk stations. On the West Coast in Los Angeles and Texas, there's a lot of regional Mexican stations. But what this chart is showing here, this is from YouTube, and this is from a couple of weeks ago. And this is the top 20 songs on YouTube, which is really indicative. And you can see here, this isn't among Hispanics. This is in the US, among all individuals. 11 of the 20 top songs are from Latin artists, and they're in Spanish. And this is really fantastic because it really shows the power and the number of views. This obviously when people go to listen on YouTube, they also are watching the video. So this Grupo Frontera happens to be #1, and then Bad Bunny with his Monica song was #2. One thing, when I showed this to somebody recently, they said, well, where's Taylor Swift? Because obviously we know Taylor Swift has such a strong following, especially with her concert tour in the last year. But what's fascinating here is she's on the list, but further down. So this just goes to show the power of Spanish language media, the Spanish language music, and also, so if you look at the artists, the collaboration between different genres. So it's really a shared culture that you could see different artists collaborating together. So this is a strong indicator of how powerful the Spanish language music has become. So what we're often asked, those of us who in marketing for the U.S. Hispanic market, is like, okay, well, sounds pretty simple. There's a huge market, a lot speak Spanish, but we always remind folks is that it's not just the language, it's also cultural relevance. So what we guide businesses to do is to do both a language proficiency that is important for the market, for the target that they're reaching in the cities or the DMAs that they're reaching, but also cultural resonance and authenticity. And that is all uncovered with the right insights and the right research in order to really delve into the hearts and the unique cultures and traditions of each segment that is being addressed in the market. So what we guide clients with is your brand really ready? So in other words, if they want to come into this market or continue to grow, what are really the most important things to consider? So language, yes, is one of them, but a lot of research takes place in terms of showing appreciation and understanding of Hispanics. So sometimes there are some myths and some stereotypes, and we try to avoid those at all costs, right? Because we want to make sure that the connections are indeed authentic. So a lot of work and research is done. We often, when we talk to consumers in research, the first thing that is usually asked is, would you prefer to be addressed in this research study in English or in Spanish? And that talks to the sensitivity and the understanding of the market. We do a lot of research with our own clients, but then also here at the HMC, we do a lot of research to understand the nuances and the importance of language. And what's really fascinating is the bilingual segment. So a lot of people make the mistake in our world here in marketing, where the minute you say bilingual, they're automatically assuming that bilingual means that they're going to prefer English. And what we always have to remind clients is that bilingual is a choice, right? We like to call it our superpower, those of us who are bilingual, that we can navigate both worlds. So in being able to do that, what we found is so many Hispanics do prefer Spanish. As I was showing on the previous slides, they prefer it for a lot of the things that they do in terms of consuming media. So I talked about the music, but also in the television world, there's a lot of very strong Spanish language television, a lot of very strong Spanish language video, OTT, streaming options. So it's growing more and more, and the Spanish language is able to provide comfort, if you will, and resonance for the consumers. What we also remind clients of is everything has to be ready within an organization to really connect. So in other words, if let's say you have a storefront or a business and you're advertising in Spanish, that then often the clients will expect to have someone attend to them in Spanish at the location. So to make sure that you're really welcoming, understand the culture, so that when folks come into the store or the retail location, that they can get their questions answered and get some help in Spanish. Same things with websites and other complexities of businesses, is really understanding across the organization everything that needs to be done in order to resonate with the market. Again, the language is very fluid. And what really makes the Hispanic market unique versus other immigrant cultures that have come before Hispanics is that there is a real pride in Spanish. There is the ability to understand that being bilingual has so many benefits across the board, not just to communicate, but really to understand every other things. So here at HMC, we do a lot to help brands get ready. And there's a lot of information also on our website to help with that. So feel free to go to the HispanicMarketingCouncil.org and look at that. We host webinars on a regular basis to talk about different Hispanic marketing topics that anyone is welcome to register for and join. And we also have an annual summit in April. We're doing ours in April in New York, and there's information on our website there, which really helps really connect further to understand the power of this market. So that's what I'm going to cover, and I'm happy now to answer any questions.
Thank you, Isabella. Wow, I can't believe how many amazing stats you had crammed in there, and it was really interesting to see the stuff about the music as well. I was just really fascinated.
It is. That's a lot of fun. Yeah.
Yeah. So if anyone has any questions at this time, I know it is early in the morning. We're all just getting started here, but please go ahead and submit them in the Q&A.
In the meantime, is it okay if I ask a question?
Please go right ahead.
All right. Isabella, when you are talking to different types of organizations or industries, I assume, are there any in particular that are more resistant to being open to adapting to Spanish or to adapting to this public?
I wouldn't say resistant. There are some categories, advertising wise, that do less than others because of the complexity of their categories. So probably, one of the biggest advertising categories in the United States is the pharmaceutical category, right? And that's different from other countries, because in other countries that's not necessarily legal to do. But here, the direct to consumer advertising is a very big category. And in a lot of the pharmaceutical companies haven't been able yet to leverage as much as perhaps they would want to, because there are a lot of legal implications and complexities. But they've made a lot of improvements over the last few years, so that one is a growing one. And the same thing with the sort of the complexity of the finance category. So the typical banking categories have been active for a very long time and done it very well. But then some of the more complex investment portfolio type advertising, those again, because there's a lot of legal implications, they're navigating their way into that.
Thank you.
We have a question from Liliana, who wonders, how do you see this Hispanic trend going as it pertains to governmental organizations?
So as it applies to government organizations, if I'm understanding the question now, right now, the Spanish language, so there are translations of all important documents in Spanish and other languages, right? And so that I don't believe will change anytime soon, regardless of political opinion and things like that. It still is for even just pure legal reasons to have access to information, for the safety of individuals, to really have access to information that they can understand and comprehend.
Thanks. Patricia says, how do you approach the intense use of Anglicisms in U.S. Spanish with the rejection they may produce in other Spanish-speaking countries and even in neutral Spanish or international Spanish?
Okay, so, languages evolve, right? So there are Spanish language purists that these anglicismos and things like that, it bothers them, right? Like, puritans of language, we'll say, ¿qué dirá la Real Academia Española, no? Because it kind of choca, if you will, in terms of like these misuses of the language. But I think one has to accept that languages evolve, especially with all the young influence, right? There's new slang terms every day. And
Sure.
So again, it depending on the content that's being produced, right? So if it's a legal document, if it is government related type things, as someone asked about, there it would probably need to be rather pure. But the more advertisers lean into the way that people are speaking in the United States today, the more they will connect with them and the more that the consumers will be able to relate. So while in their original country of origin, maybe nobody spoke that way, that is the way people are speaking now. It's really the fusion and the blend of languages that is creating all these new words. So I think that will continue.
Great. Eric is wondering, what are good examples of tech companies that are targeting Hispanic markets in a meaningful way?
Oh, there's so many. Tech companies specifically, if you mean technology and things like that, or computer companies, but if you look at sort of all the different advertisers that are out there right now, digital companies, even Google is advertising to Hispanics in Spanish. All of those types of companies, they really want to make sure that they are capturing the opportunity. There are a lot of folks that are going to lean into Spanish, as I showed you. So why not address them in Spanish? So I would say, if you look around, you're going to see so many different great examples of ones that do it really well.
Great. Eric is wondering, what are some of the typical mistakes that companies make when addressing the U.S. Spanish market? Are there any informative examples of advertising that had unintended consequences that we could learn from?
Oh, there's so many. And it starts with language. So I would say sometimes the biggest mistake that folks can make, or average marketers can make, is they don't use experts and they assume they know things, right? So they may be doing stereotypical things or translations that don't translate. So the most famous example, and this is so old, but everybody loves to talk about it, years ago.
The Chevy Nova.
Exactly. And right. So that kind of still happens every once in a while. But things like that. But the biggest mistake is that and Hispanics can get easily offended by stereotypes. So in other words, ads that only show, a family, with a piñata and an abuela and a kitchen. Like Hispanics look at that and say, we're more than that, right? Yep. And so it's really important for marketers to look at what are the real insights and not the stereotypical ones, and not use the language and the insights properly.
Thanks, Isabella. The next question is, first of all, saying that thanks for a great presentation. It was really insightful. I'd like to know, what type of Spanish variant do you recommend using in the US?
So what we advise clients is, if it is, depending on where your advertising is going to run, right? So if it's going to run in California and Texas, then you should use Spanish that is certainly more of a nod towards regional Mexican. And the Spanish language, let me say this, the Spanish language is the Spanish language, right? Proper Spanish is proper Spanish, right? But then there are sort of sayings and different folks with different sort of intonations of their accent. But for advertising that runs nationally, there is a neutral, if you will, Spanish sort of, or individuals' talent, right, that can be used in commercials that where they're speaking Spanish, but you can't necessarily say, oh, that's definitely from Spain, or definitely from Argentina, or definitely from Mexico. It is an ability to speak Spanish in a more neutral way. Old people who are go back a bit, folks used to like to call it Walter Cronkite Spanish, right? Sure. But a lot of people don't even know who that is anymore, unfortunately. And so Walter Cronkite it's the same thing in the English language, right? So when you turn on English language TV, for instance, and you watch the evening news, the person who's delivering that news does not particularly have a New York accent or a Southern drawl. They have a very neutral type, those who deliver national news. So again, the answer is, depending on where, if it's a New York-based campaign only, then you could have much more of a Caribbean intonation. But because of the diversity of populations, right? So New York, for instance, used to be Puerto Rican, and Dominican. And now it is almost a little bit of everything. So you don't want to alienate groups either by using sort of outdated demographic compositions of cities or markets.
Great. I just want to mention to attendees that we've decided today, rather than going into breakout rooms, that we're going to extend Q&As because people were really liking this. So we've got time for a couple more questions. The next question is from Orly, wondering, interested in hearing about the specific linguistic characteristics when addressing U.S. Hispanics.
Well, I'm not a linguistic expert, but I guess what I would say is the best thing to do is use experts who are, right, in terms of navigating where the advertising or the communication is going to be seen or heard, and then tailor it to that. But the safest is to use some neutrality. And again, depending on the target audience, right? So if it's a younger audience, maybe you want to bring in some of those music tracks and things like that, right? To really dial in and capture sort of the emotional part of advertising versus just the linguistic part, just the wording part, right? So there's a lot of different elements that go into communication. It's music, right? It's not just sort of the words,
right?
Right. So again, I'm not sure if I answered the question, but
no, I think that was great. Laura is wondering, do you get questions from clients about the buying power of the Hispanic population within the U.S., and how do you approach that?
Yes, absolutely. We get it all the time. And so the numbers I showed in the beginning, those numbers are almost too big for folks to understand, right? It's billions of dollars, right? And so the questions that we mostly get is there's a lot of myths about the Hispanic market in terms of, oh, well, didn't they just, as an example, didn't they just come here and they're too poor and they only work in landscaping or janitors, and therefore they're not going to be able to afford our product, right? So the buying power conversation comes in when we explain, well, hang on, that's not true. And folks do aggregate, they grow. And so what we're typically talking to them about is your average salary or average household income to afford different products, right? And there's many, many ways that Hispanics, as we know, they come to this country or we come to this country and we find a way to make it work. So if we need to buy a car, then we pull resources together as needed until we're able to do it on our own. So the buying power question comes up a lot. It is an economic conversation that we're often having. Yes.
Right. Interesting. Erica is wondering, another speaker yesterday said that the White House were not doing a great job at translating their website. What's your take on that?
Well, I have not looked at their website, but that's disappointing. And so to hear, of course, they probably, if that was called out to them, maybe they would strive to do better. So I guess it doesn't surprise me that much, right? Sure. Because if we probably did a audit of every website and how well it was translated or transcribed in terms of providing equitable information, there's probably a lot of room for growth there.
Sure. You wonder how many people are focused on user experience at governmental agencies. So
yeah.
The next question is, what do you think deters some of these bigger companies from directly advertising to the Spanish-speaking consumers?
Lack of knowledge, sometimes, a lack of resources, and maybe sometimes I think that there is a myth that it's really complicated. And while it is complex, nothing is impossible, right? And so sometimes it just takes a matter of a new group of clients or marketers at that specific company for them to take notice. So sometimes it's just they have already so much going on that they haven't quite tackled that, or they may be under the impression that they don't need to. And what we can see time and time again is the leader in every category is active in Hispanic marketing, right? Sure. Whether that be automotive, fast food, packaged goods. So they're the ones missing out, and sooner or later they're going to realize that they got to get started.
The next comment is, thanks a lot for the presentation. I wonder if linguistic accuracy is ever evaluated against cultural accuracy in market research studies. There are many companies that prioritize a cultural approach, but then use machine translation mostly unedited And I wonder how that is received and perceived by Hispanic customers.
Great question. It is definitely received negatively and perceived poorly, right? So, for instance, the ad agency that I work at, right, we have a whole staff of translators, right, and copywriters, because you can't just use machine. And now with this whole growth of AI, there has to be more and more attention to this, right? Because it's one thing to put words on a page. It's another thing to put words on the page that have the intended outcome that you want them to do, right? Persuasive language, and really culturally relevant language. So that is a huge mistake when folks do that. Huge, huge, huge mistake. But luckily, those who take Hispanic marketing seriously do have the right folks on staff to ensure that they're not just like using a Google Translator or any of those other software platforms.
Yeah. Thanks everyone out there for the great questions. We're going to keep taking them because we have a few more minutes. Taka is wondering, how close would you say U.S. Spanish is to Mexican Spanish? And will Mexican Spanish feel comfortable for Hispanic people?
I think there's a bit of a myth that Spanish is different across the board, right? So now, of course, within Mexico, right, there's all sorts of regionalisms. Like, for instance, like I'm from Spain, right? And so a lot of people will say to me things like, tú hablas castellano. Todo el mundo habla castellano, right? The difference is that there are regionalisms and just different things. Once the communications in the US, of course, it's a bit neutralized, unless we want to really lean into an insight of a specific dicho or refrán, right? But in terms of acceptance, right, again, it depends on where you live, right? Because if you live in an area of Texas where there's a lot of folks from those places, you're going to hear a lot more of that, just the way people speak, right? Here I live in Miami, so you can imagine there's a lot of Colombian type words that are used here, Venezuelan, Cubanismos, right, that aren't used in other places. And that's wonderful. It really enriches the culture. It makes language that much more beautiful and interesting, that it isn't all the same, right? That it's this beautiful, rich potpourri, if you will, of language and expression.
Thanks. Another question from Orly. The term Latinx has become widespread in past years. What's your take on it?
Okay. Latinx has become widespread among some marketers, but not among the population. So there's been some studies, some surveys that have gone out about this. And I want to say the last number I saw was only 3% of Latinos in the United States would say that they would prefer that for themselves, right? And so marketers are using it a lot. They're just in terms of a term that encompasses all Hispanics, and they don't want to do, the old construct of ellos y ellas, so they're taking the X, right? But people individually don't really call themselves. If you were to say to them, "What are you?" Not that many people say that they're Latinx. On the same note, not that many people would say when who are you? What are you? Most people don't say they're Latino or Hispanic unless they're in an environment that's where the conversation is going around. Most people will say, soy mexicana, soy colombiana, soy venezolana, etc. No, so it's almost like become a marketing term more than a real term that folks or populations are using.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So we still have about 6 minutes before our next session, and we're just going to keep rolling because there's some really great questions here. Erica's wondering, which Spanish do you recommend to companies to use, neutral Spanish across the U.S. or customized according to the region? For example, Mexican or Cuban Spanish.
Great question. It depends on where your communication is going to be used or highlighted. But probably the advice would be use neutral, right? For the most part, because you don't want to alienate either, right? And so, you know, I use the example of California is mostly Mexican, but there's also a lot of people who aren't Mexican, right? So if you use a word that's really only to be understood by Mexicans, then you're going to miss out for the El Salvadorian population, et cetera, right? The nice thing though, right, is this melting pot of communities. Like we've all begun to learn the dichos, right, and expressions from other countries that we might not have known if back home. But if you have to pick, you know, a neutral type of approach is the safer one, in terms of really full comprehension of the messaging.
Great. Laura says, lately I've seen more ads that mix both phrases in Spanish and in English, and it seems very intentional. Is that a trend or just the focus of a particular age group that they're aiming at?
It is very intentional and it is a trend. So for those of us who are bilingual, we know we do this all the time. We don't even mean to do it. We don't even realize we're doing it, but that's how people speak now. It just, when you can't find words, you just sort of mix it up. And so of course it's more prevalent in a younger group, right?
Mm-hmm.
Older Hispanics might be more of a purist type of group, right? In terms of like, eso no se dice, se dice así, but it is very intentional and it's being used by a lot, because if you're seeing these ads, right, then there's a fluidity between, if you're seeing them on TV or in video, right,
Mm-hmm.
you're seeing it because there are Hispanics who are watching English. So why not capture them culturally with sort of a wink and a nod to, I know you're there, I know you're watching, and here's a message for you.
Myra wonders, some companies believe or state that translating into US Spanish requires a lower registry, lower reading level. Would you say that this is somehow a reality right now or just another stereotype?
I think it could be another stereotype. And again, it depends, I think, on the context of the translation, right? For what is it academia use? Is it commercial use? What is the use for that? But at the same time, right, if someone were to even take like the New York Times, right, as a newspaper and put that into an English program and say, what reading level is this? It's intentionally not at a very high level. I don't know what it is, but I remember years ago seeing it and saying, okay, that's fair, because all of sort of the communication that's put out, the ultimate desire is that everyone could understand it, right? So again, I think it depends on what its intention is and what its use is, but US Spanish, I'm not sure if that means it's just using a little bit sort of less of a sophistication of vocabulary and less richness in vocabulary, for that reason.
Isabella, thanks so much for spending some extra time with us this morning. These are just really great. We're going to take one more question and then we've got to get ready for our next presentation.
Okay.
But the last question comes from Elisa, who wonders, you know, not many tech companies have a US linguist on their localization team, but many companies target the Hispanic population in the US. How should we start the conversation to incorporate that specialty in our teams instead of using MT? Much of the US content is machine translated.
Right. I don't know how to start. I think it's really find out what the need is and what the use would be. I think sometimes there is a little bit of a resistance of how much work goes behind it versus what the payoff is going to be, right? So to answer the question, how do you get started? I would say, you know, go to some experts who really know a lot about the tech field in that translation world and see, you know, how they can help you. So, you know, sometimes the perception of how complex things are is not as bad as one thinks, but
Sure.
It does require, everything requires expertise and time and effort. So hopefully,
I think that's great advice.
Yeah.
And on that note, we are out of time. Thank you so much again, Isabella, and hope you have a great day.
Thank you so much for having me.
You bet.
Enjoy.
And we'll be back in just a minute, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks.